YouTube and social media. Okay, got it. Okay. So I'm waiting for my security.
Welcome everyone. Bienvenidos. We will start in 2 more minutes. Just give us some time. Right now we are already streaming in YouTube. Thanks everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome everyone.
You probably need to disconnect from YouTube, Sam, because you're going to start hearing yourself. Okay. Okay, my gay. So I hope everybody has their coffee or drink of preference. It's not Friday, but it's very close. So we can make that count. I am Sam. Whenever you tell me, I can start. I know we're getting people signing in right now. Well, we have a couple of minutes just to say hi to all our guests, colleagues, friends. We have this opportunity to meet once in a month or so. So we hardly
Rosario.
have the opportunity. Monday, yes?
So one thing before we do, so this is going to be our last event of the year. Before actually we forget about it, happy holidays, felices fiestas. Nuestro último evento del año. Yeah. So basically, yeah, I just want to say felices fiestas, happy holidays. It's been a good year to work with all of you. Good seeing you. And anyway, next year, best wishes for the end of the year and following year.
It's not even Thanksgiving. Yeah.
I know.
You sound like my kid. He already has his Christmas trees up and running.
Wow, before Halloween.
Yeah, he's all over the place in Christmas. Anyway. Okay, I'm gonna start, if that's okay with all of you and our guests and our speakers today. Thank you for joining us for our most nurturing coffee break and last coffee break of the year. We're very excited about the guests we have today and our speakers that have agreed to be part of this discussion, so thank you. We're going to talk about something highly important, a growing problem, very sensitive, and hardly addressed. I mean, approach it in a way that it's, improving. So the topic for today is unincorporated and economic disadvantages communities from both access to water and sanitation along the US-Mexico border. And I was reading today, coincidentally, an article related to housing and housing development, which is, related to this, and how concrete has driven most of our developments on the latest 30 years, the contamination that comes with it, and how we build those vulnerable communities cheaper than others, with all the social and cultural consequences built into it, because sometimes those communities are isolated from the rest of the cities or communities, and that is not just not make them vulnerable in terms of water contamination, but it's also, a lot of other things, social, economic, and political involvement, and education, and sometimes cultural belongingness. Belongingness, is that a word in English? I don't know. But the sense of belonging, it's affected also by those communities that are in the border region. So they are in the border, but they belong to nobody knows where. So anyway, I was reading this interesting article about that, and we had the coffee break today. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers, if my computer agrees with me. Let's see. I just quickly want to thank our sponsors. California Institute for Water Resources, Arizona Water Resources Research Center, Texas Water Resources Institute, North American Development Bank, and also the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has been our sponsor so far. So thank you, as always, for your support. That's the way the forum keeps growing. I'm going to introduce my co-host first, Samuel. He's the Associate Director of the Forum. He is responsible for the Management and Policy Research Program at the University of California, Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. He works on strategies to improve the water management for anthropogenic and environmental requirements by developing reservoir reoperation policies to improve the human and environmental water requirements, and many more things. So thank you, Sam.
Gracias, Rosario. Thanks, Rosario. My pleasure to introduce Rosario Sanchez, the director of the Permanent Forum, good colleague, friend, more than 20 years of experience in groundwater, also developing a lot of the groundwater maps, sharing information, and being a good voice on our conscience when we're talking about water along the border. So welcome everyone.
And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panelist, because we want this to be a discussion panel. Isis Mejías. Isis has been a passionate water sanitation and hygiene WASH advocate for more than a decade. Her career in WASH started in her work in Kenya, talking about Africa, with Rotarian Engineers Without Borders, while working on her chemical engineering and her PhD on environmental engineering. She has worked in designing various WASH programs around the world, especially for primary schools. She's also the founder of WASH Research Network of the Venezuelan Science Incubator and a Rotary Water and Sanitation Rotarian Action Group ambassador. Her mission is to create awareness of the impact that improved WASH has on living and healthier life and protecting our planet. Thank you, Isis, for being here. I'm going to introduce Professor Susie Dye. She is Associate Professor at Texas A&M. She works on evaluating environmental hazards, substances, interactions with the environment and species and biological systems that can degrade and detoxify the pollutants. Her research group has established broad analytical platforms to survey a wide spectrum of natural and man-made toxic chemicals. Susie develops qualitative and quantitative methods for molecular characterization, protein analysis, and proteomics when working in different environmental systems. Thank you, Susie, for being here. I'm going to introduce now Brent Fewell. Did I pronounce that right? Fewell?
Fewell. Just like yes.
Fewell. Thank you. He serves as chair and founder of Earth and Water Law and has over 28 years of experience in public policy, advocacy, and environmental law. He is an environmental lawyer and former corporate executive and senior U.S. EPA official in EPA's offices of water and congressional and intergovernmental relations. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but he's co-founder and general counsel of business development lead of Water Finance Exchange. He works with water and wastewater utilities, advising on governance and compliance related matters. He also co-chairs the Water Ad Hoc Group, aimed at advocating for additional funding and policy reform to increase the sustainability and resilience of water utilities across the nation. Thank you, Brent, for being here. Sam, you want to introduce Carlos?
Yeah, my pleasure to introduce Carlos Rubenstein. A lot of experience on water-related issues along the border. I think, if I remember correct, you work also in the Rio Grande Water Master, and then, well, which is part of TCQ, then your TCQ at Austin. We met a couple of times there. City manager of Brownsville. Yeah, it brings an important suite of strategies, skills related with water management, water quality, international water resources management, or the knowledge of water along the border. and now, I mean, it's a good collaborator of the Permanent Forum of the National Waters. Bienvenido, Carlos. Welcome. And Mario. Mario, another a good expert. Again, almost 40 decades or 4 decades of experience in water resources management along Conagua. I think also in the always keeping an eye on the water resources management, the water policies along the border. Later, he has also worked in Conagua and some other, Conagua, IMTA, and other places. Now he's an independent consultant and another very good friend of the Permanent Forum. Mario, bienvenido. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we're going to go ahead with the discussion, if that's okay with all of you. And I'm going to start with Isis, if this is okay with you. We're going to talk about this. Let's go broad, and then we can focus and narrow down the analysis or the discussion. What are the global problems? I mean, from your experience, what are the global problems related to the topic that we are addressing today in terms of water sanitation, water access to disadvantaged communities? Because we know this is not a problem only between Mexico and the US. This is a problem everywhere. So please give us your insight on what's going on out there.
So in my experience, the first main problem that I see is disease transmission. We know that at least 2 billion people today drink unsafe water, and more than 2 billion don't have access to adequate sanitation. And when you take these two problems together, it becomes much larger. We look at the term WASH, which stands for water, sanitation, and hygiene. It shows that water plays a much bigger role, right? Than the cup of water we drink every day. Having access to WASH includes having sufficient clean water with acceptable quality, having access to a toilet at home, solid waste collection, adequate drainage, and the third term, it's a hygiene aspect, which is having access to hand washing facilities, the ability to clean spaces where we live, the utensils we use to eat, and even the containers we use for water collection, for example. So we see that at least one of these three components is missing in vulnerable communities, and this is when pathogen transmission occurs in the environment. And this eventually comes to our homes where we live, and it eventually reaches our bodies. And it affects our health, our time, and the effect, it's a ripple effect, right? It affects our household budget, our overall quality of life. So we're used to thinking that the problem is about water quantity, when in reality, the root cause is water quality. We have limited amount of resources, of water resources in the planet. And this 0.3% that represents the surface waters in the world, it's the one that is threatened the most by microorganisms. And this usually happens in areas that don't have adequate sanitation, sewage collection, solid waste collection, or that there's simply not enough water to address the hygiene portion. So this is particularly relevant for regions like the US and Mexico border, which has more than 100,000 people living in areas like the colonias, which can mean that people are paying more for inferior quality, or for water that has to be trucked in, or they have to haul it from faraway taps. And then they resort in using water storage tanks for collecting the water. And when they're not closed properly, or they have to be cleaned periodically, it's a source of contamination. So that's the first problem. The second main problem is the lack of water governance with fair representation. So any functioning water and sanitation system requires a governing body that operates the system, that establishes the rules for water usage among everybody who is using the service, and that maintains the system over time as the equipment starts to fail. And typically these O&M costs are harder to secure over the long term than the capital costs. So communities that don't have a functioning water governance have difficulty securing external funding for funding infrastructure projects because there is no governance for O&M services from funding that comes typically, for example, from development agencies or even international NGOs. And those communities that do have water governance committees, they don't often have the fair representation from all the groups that use it. We see a lot of this in communities, for example, where women are not appropriately represented, even though they're disproportionately affected in the household because they're the bearers of the burden of having to go fetch the water. So in the case of the US-Mexico border, this becomes more critical because of the shared transboundary resources and all the coordination that needs to happen between all of the users, including small farming communities and the colonias that are isolated and that don't often have adequate sanitation services.
That's a lot of information. Oh, I mean, very, very, very important. Interesting. I mean, it's not just about water, right? It's about a lot of other things, culturally, socially related. And with that, I'm going to give the word to Brent. Having this background, like this overall perspective from a world problem, what are the specifics on water sanitation here in the border from your experience? I mean, how big is the problem? Because we hear here and there, and then we see that. How big is the problem? Do we need to care right away? I mean, is it growing? Is it where are we in terms of this?
Yeah, Rosario, thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. It's obviously a growing problem. It's been a problem for a number of decades, but it's only getting worse. The Water Finance Exchange, my co-founder and I launched a couple of years ago because we recognized the problem of underserved and disadvantaged communities with respect to water infrastructure was simply getting worse. And many of these communities continue to fall through the cracks. Thankfully, Congress has recently appropriated over $50 billion to assist communities with failing infrastructure. With respect to unincorporated communities such as the colonias and along the border and elsewhere, there is estimated of 35% of U.S. populations live in unincorporated areas, and that's obviously not just colonias, but many other communities around the U.S. But what we are seeing are similar problems across those unincorporated areas, and that's a lack of access to resources, financial and technical capacity limitations to manage systems. As the doctor was saying, most of these cases are decentralized systems. You all may have heard of similar problems in Alabama in the Black Belt, where large populations in unincorporated areas have serious sanitation problems where the soils don't perk. So these are issues across many areas. Obviously, Texas and the border states have very serious problems. The good news is that this administration is committed to doing what they can to reach these communities and to provide clean, safe water. There are a number of regulatory and legal barriers to do that. Obviously, governance structures help tremendously. If you have a county, and Carlos can speak to this when he talks, there's an exciting development with many of these unincorporated areas where the county, if you have a county authority, can promote regional solutions where communities that are clustered together could possibly work with nearby communities to share services, share operators. And these are things that we at the Water Finance Exchange are really encouraging communities to consider. And it's really exciting when you start to get civic leaders and community leaders together to talk about what's possible. Many things can happen that you would not realize would be possible. And there does become a kind of a growing excitement where there's been despair in the past, where these problems just seem overwhelming. There are opportunities to address these problems. So, you know, it's a big problem, but we are excited that with folks on this call who are committed to us reaching out and serving these communities and helping them. I'm optimistic that we can reach that goal.
Thank you, Brent. You mentioned two important words: leadership, right? Community leadership and willingness as well.
That's right.
So that's a recipe for basically everything that deals with water, at least in community participation. I'm going to go ahead and ask Susie. I know, Susie, you've been working a lot on water quality in vulnerable communities in the border. I want to know your perspective. What can you tell us in terms of drinking water quality and its relationship with the border region for those communities that depend on whatever available water they have, regardless of the quality? And what is your experience in that regard?
Yeah. Thank you first for your invitation to join this panel, and I'm honored to be here today and have this discussion with all those colleagues. As you introduced, my research focuses on water quality contamination remediation and exposure surveillance. So currently, I'm actually leading two private well water quality surveillance projects. One is in the South Texas counties, and the other one is actually in Iowa, because I worked as a faculty there before I came back to Texas A&M. Given the context for this panel discussion, I also want to point out that the rural vulnerable population that relies on private well for drinking water is across our country, not just in Texas. So give you a very brief estimate, in the US, approximately 41.8 million people, about 13% of the population, obtain drinking water from private wells. And the private wells are not regulated currently under the EPA regulation as the Safe Drinking Water Act. So exposure to those contaminants in drinking water represents a chronic exposure that can lead to a various disease, particularly on those chemical contamination. And because of the absence and regulation and awareness, people who drink private well water with contaminants are at a higher health risk. That if the contamination contains higher than the known safe level, and I will give arsenic as an example. So this is a commonly known naturally present water contaminant, and it has kind of cancer impacts and other nerve system impacts on the health side. In Texas, over 55% of the water was drawn from the groundwater. And then the Gulf Coast aquifer is one of the largest aquifers, has been characterized to potentially have high arsenic content in the water. Then from the existing data that Texas Water Development Board had in the past from the surveillance, the analysis suggested for the public water supply, about 2% of the sites have well shown water arsenic level higher than the EPA Safe Drinking Water Act standards, 10 microgram per liter, with the highest up to more than 80 microgram per liter. However, for the private well test site data, it suggests about more than 9% contain higher than the safe level regulated by EPA, and with the highest one average up to more than 500 microgram per liter. So if we map the social vulnerability index with the locations where the high arsenic concentration has been detected, we can find a rural population rely more on private well, there's no doubt, and then associated with a poor social vulnerability as well. One of the problems for those communities is they do not only lack the resources to remediate or fix the problem. Sometimes they even lack the knowledge and the information to recognize this could be a problem. And this is why for the project, when we're trying to conduct the study in South Texas counties, we call this project Arsenic Awareness Campaign. So I only have 4 minutes just to talk about drinking water quality, and I don't mean to spend my time defining what is quality. But in simple terms, quality means meeting the standards or expectations. For drinking water quality in feasible ways, is meeting EPA drinking water standards. So drinking water standard or the quality is dependent on the testing standards. And there's a joke about a quality assessment. It's called don't test, don't tell. The sad fact is many of those vulnerable communities don't have the knowledge as well as the resource to even test the drinking water. And then we have a long way to go to improve drinking water quality in those communities. At the current stage, I believe in many campaigns, bring up people's awareness is a primary goal in the first stage. Once the individual and the community are aware of this issue, then changes and improvements can be made in the future. So more tests is one of the first goals we need to push in those communities.
Thank you, Susie. And I'm writing down some important information here, and this is homework for us to get those links. How to test, you know, you probably have information on that. If you don't mind, Susie, sharing that information for the community, for the people that are signing up today. It's important. The awareness part is important because it has to be preceded by some information, right? So here is information, how to test it, test your well, right? And check it out. I mean, we take it for given because it's groundwater, it's not contaminated, but not these days. These days we need to be careful, especially for this level of contaminants and the risk associated with it. So before we go, we're going to share those links here in the chat. So for the people that are signing in. Anyway, Sam, back to you.
So now we're going with Carlos. So from your experience as a governmental employee, so this is back some years ago, what was the perspective about water sanitation from the governmental perspective? What were the lessons or the perspective, the lessons that you learned while you were managing drinking water as a governmental employee?
Excellent question. Thank you. Thank you for that, Samuel. And it's great to be in one more coffee break. I always enjoy these, and congratulations to you all for putting them together. I think the lessons learned dovetail into what Brent was saying and why WFX were trying to assist these communities. So I'm going to go with lessons learned and assumptions that lead us into not correcting the problem. From the perspective as having been a former health director at the city of Brownsville, the lessons learned is that inadequate availability to water and wastewater services also manifests itself in the community as a higher incidence of communicable diseases, particularly gastrointestinal diseases. And those end up affecting the communities or the populations at risk in a disproportionate manner. The other aspect of it, as having been in the municipal side, while you recognize that you have pockets of communities either within your corporate limits or just outside, but still within your service area, the choice of extending service to them ends up being a very financial, tough question to answer. Are you going to have your existing users subsidize the substantial infrastructure improvements that need to take place to bring those communities in and provide them a better service? It is not about whether they're entitled to it or not. They are. It's just who's going to pay for it. That brings us to an assumption of lessons learned that I learned when I was at the TCEQ and had the pleasure of working with several folks, in particular Steve Niemeyer, who's on this meeting with us today. very well focused on this issue, is the assumption that if we have money that is available to correct a problem, that the problem is going to get fixed. Bad assumption. In some cases, yes, you do. And I'm glad Mario is nodding. I'm sure he's going to be able to say his corresponding side from Mexico as well. I know he and I share a lot of the same views. But the issue that we found is we recognized we had colonias. We recognized we had areas that were improperly developed. We passed laws to prevent future substandard subdivisions from being created, and we developed a fund for economically distressed areas. We called it that, and we thought, okay, now we got it all fixed. One, you can't have any more colonias developed because we already passed the law, and two, we have funding to help all of these issues. Bad assumptions. While we don't have necessarily the same level of increase of substandard subdivisions as we had back in the 1970s and 1980s, there's still some out there that we've just not been able to correct. And there's several reasons for that. So you have money available and you have a project or a program available to identify them in the system, but then you find out that the way the land was subdivided didn't dedicate roadways, for example, as a public right-of-way, and because it is still privately held, there's prohibitions of spending state monies or federal dollars towards fixing the problem. And so that impediment ends up preventing any fixes that you might have on the water side. Another hard lesson learned is, and Dr. Maria Elena Giner with IBWC just finished her dissertation on this, when we were able to apply money to a fix, we assumed that that was going to allow that community to grow. It's a fair assumption, but in reality, providing them water and wastewater did not result in the growth in those communities to provide for the rates to be able to maintain the O&M, operating and expenditures. And so now you strap communities that before didn't have access to adequate water and wastewater services with a failing system 10, 15 years down the road because they don't have the rate structure to do it. The last point I'll make is Brent made reference to the large funding that's available from the federal government, and it is generational type funding. And we know that over the last decades, for example, in Texas, we have provided a substantial amount of money in EDAP, as I mentioned before. The problem is the assumption that these communities are going to be able to navigate the processes to be able to compete for the money. And when they're able to compete with the money, for the money, the assumption that the money will be there. The fact is, in the state of Texas, every time we have opened up funding for EDAP, the program has been oversubscribed. We do not have enough money to meet the entire demand, coupled with all the other impediments that I mentioned. The problem that we see now, and I'm going to close with what Brent teed me up to talk about, or asked that I talk about, is so now you got communities that are understanding that federal money is available and it's a generational opportunity and they need to take advantage of it. And they are understanding that they don't have the institutional knowledge or capacity or resources within their entities to be able to compete. They're coming together to work together for the economies of scale. Entities like WFX, who has been fortunate in receiving a significant amount of philanthropic funding, can put funding available for those communities to help them with a pre-development phase. It is critical that we recognize that the biggest limitation sometimes in advancing these projects is just not knowing how the hell to get there for these communities. That's where pre-development assistance, technical assistance come into place. And somewhere the last lesson we've learned is all of the funding that I mentioned is really bad about not providing reimbursement for this much needed pre-development work. So there you have it.
Yeah, gracias, Carlos. Thanks, Carlos. And
De nada, es un placer.
to me, it is always the complexities of not only the finance and also many of the assumptions. We just assume that just put the money there and it will be fixed, and there are more complexities. I don't know, now turning back on the southern side of the border con Mario. So yeah, in Mexico, también se cuecen habas. We have, I think in both sides, oh man, what is the perspective from Mexico, from the Mexico side? Is the problem growing? What are the dynamics at the binational level concerning this issue? Any efforts to address this issue of drinking water and sanitation? And just to put it in a tiny bit of perspective, now we have Article 4 that was modified in the Constitution. Now everyone is constitutionally mandated that everyone will have access to drinking water and sanitation in Mexico. Is that happening? Is it not happening? How is it going to happen? Who is going to enforce it? We have a long history of having really nice regulations and nothing on the ground. So I don't know, Mario, ¿nos podrías dar una perspectiva? Could you give us a perspective?
Thank you, Samuel. Hi, Rosario. Hello, friends from the panel. Lots of good friends also in the audience. Thank you for being here with you in another coffee break. Well, unfortunately, I believe that the problem will continue to grow. That's a fact. And this is because we do not adequately address its causes. I think we do not diagnose well what's happening there. We want to face it in a traditional way, and this doesn't work anymore. And we don't accept it. We don't understand it. This is a problem. At least from the Mexican side, these types of communities are largely isolated, rural or peri-urban. Most of the times, irregular settlements. I think there are 5 main causes of this. The first thing that address the big picture. The first thing is at the border, we do not have surface and groundwater available for population growth. This is a fact on both sides, and particularly in Mexico. And we must say that not water available according to traditional standards, traditional technology, and traditional location and use. There is a bad assumption, okay? The other thing is that these communities lack human, material, and financial resources to face supply, sanitation on their own. So they are lacking of all of them. The institutional support on the Mexican side is by pulses. And these pulses are because of the different municipal and state periods of election. And most of the times it is always insufficient. The state, municipal, and local institutional arrangements, the way it is being handled, the problem is not adequate to face the problem. Or if they are adequate, they are disjoint or do not coordinate it. And also, most of the times in Mexico, these authorities do not enforce the urban and territorial development plans. They issue, but they don't comply with it. This is a fact. Another thing that is a root cause, I believe, is that most of the times, I'm sure that NatBank is hearing me, and I stress that because I lived it, that the technologies for water supply and sanitation are almost always wrongly chosen, especially for sanitation. These communities are not urban. They don't have the resources. They don't have the scientific knowledge. So it is useless to put traditional sanitation technologies. Wetland is a solution, but most of the time it has been discarded for many reasons. And also resources, and this goes for NatBank as well, resources are not well focused and accessible to those communities. The dynamics of the growth of this kind of communities, you need to look at the socioeconomic perspectives. Most of the members of those communities are not integrated. They are not a community as we know it, because they are not informed what are the responsibilities and the rights, and they don't even care what the rights and the responsibilities of the local authorities. This is because most of the times there are irregular settlements, and they don't want to be on the spot because they are irregular. Unfortunately, water, it is not part of the criteria for urban planning and growth in Mexico, at least, or for the establishment of new population settlements. Now, the famous human right to access of water and sanitation, the Article 4 of the Mexican Constitution, it is more a fashionable political discourse than a materialized public policy articulated with resources and technology and human support. It is not a matter of funding. Carlos said that. It is not, if you have money, you don't solve the problem. There are many other things that you need to have to solve the problem. And most of these things are mostly social. You need to engage the community. And this is always part of the failure in many communities. It is not a matter of making public forums. This is not a good. You need to go to the ground to those communities to handle the problem. I have seen on my experience at a global level that in a short period of time, recently, there is a tendency to make visible this problem of marginalized rural communities peri-urban. The World Bank, where I'm a consultant, IDB as well, have issued manuals and guides for the attention of these groups for supply and sanitation. They're available, they're online. Likewise, they do have specific programs to focus on subsidies and credit resources to these communities. Examples, in Latin America, you can see transboundary, Bolivia and Peru do have projects. Chile and Argentina have projects, joint projects. La Plata Basin, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina have joint projects, and Ecuador and Peru have them. We need to learn from these lessons. We need to learn. At the US-Mexican border, sorry to say so, NatBank should privilege these communities, and they have not been until now. Their portfolio of credits and subsidies, together with the EPA-PIF, should focus, prioritize these communities. It is necessary to review the operation rules and make training manuals. Issue ad hoc technologies for these communities. Also, the capacity building should be considered in the project, the integral project, not only technology and money. You need to train the communities to deliver themselves the service of water supply and sanitation. There is not enough capacity on the municipalities to attend the many communities there. So they need to change, but also PDAP, the PDAP that from NatBank should help in preparation of a project that must be comprehensive, not technical and financial, also social part. And capitalize the examples that I mentioned from South America, but also examples from Africa and the Middle East, where I have worked in recent times. I've seen that this is working if you should integrate the communities with the project from the beginning and make them handle the project. there is not enough capacity at the institutions to handle so many of these communities. You need to give them the possibility to help themselves. I believe that the current models need to be adapted if they want to be successful. It seems to me that in several states, the legislations and regulations give room to this, but in others not. I have seen in many countries, organized civil society has been more effective in achieving successful results for this type of communities. However, they don't have the coverage or the resources to carry out these tasks. That is this municipal responsibility. But we need to learn from them what they have achieved, the methodologies, the procedures, and how to engage with the communities. This is not big cities. We are talking about a couple of people living in a marginalized world. Thank you.
Yeah, gracias, Mario. Thank you. And it really speaks to a lot of the things that, so before actually, well, I'm making this short announcement or comment. Everyone, please make sure if you have a question or a comment, please make sure to write it on the chat. I have seen kind of both, right? That at the bigger scale it is a huge issue, not only the drinking water or not only having water, but clean water for drinking. Sanitation is even worse. Everyone gets boats by bringing a pipe, but not by taking the water out, and that has been a trend. It is also, people will be surprised how many people, what is the population in the United States that also doesn't have access to affordable water, to sanitation. Similarly, like in Mexico, it's just impressive. Just to put it some numbers, in California, we have about 1 million people without access to clean, safe, affordable water. And that is just California. You think about Arizona, New Mexico, Texas along the border, and then the other 7 states along the Mexican border. So here we have a couple of questions from Steve and Roger. And for any of the panelists, if you want to make a further comment or if you want to take any of these questions. So Steve, would it make sense to have an organization dedicated to assisting marginalized communities in applying for funding and managerial and technical assistance? Will that work? Roger, go ahead. Yes.
So Sam, I wanted to address that question because that's precisely what Global Wash does. It's a nonprofit organization that empowers community with the technical knowledge required to scale water and sanitation services. And we focus really on the first step, which is developing a needs assessment to figure out what are the water demands, how much water is needed, what is the potential solutions that are specifically for this community, what technologies would be appropriate for this community, and we look at the sanitation portion as well. But it's very difficult to find funding for this type of efforts because the majority of the international development agencies or international NGOs want to dive straight to infrastructure type projects, and it's very little focus is given to the planning phase that really needs to happen, and in some cases it can last more than a year.
Mario.
I think Carlos was first. Carlos raised his hand first.
I was right after you. I'll go after you, Mario. Please.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Well, as I said, and Isis, I endorse what Isis said. If you want to include civil society through different organizations, international organizations, it is good, but it is not enough. Why? At least on Mexico, at least on the Mexican side, you need to include in the Mexican regulations, in the leyes estatales de agua, in the water, the state water regulations, to give the possibility to these communities to develop themselves, providing them the resources, providing them the technology, providing them how to do the things, to train them, to build capacity within those communities. It is the responsibility of the municipalities and the states and the Mexican Federation to help them, not to solve the problem for them. Otherwise, as Carlos said, there is not enough resources to do that. And never will be enough resources to solve the problem. Again, we must think differently. We need to change the chip of ourselves. We need to address differently. And the only solution is to help them to do what they need to do, not we solve for them. So this is my thinking. Thank you.
Excellent points, Mario. I'm going to add to that, and I'll echo what Dr. Mejia said and what Mario said. I'll point out, Steve, I loved your question. Think about the entities that already exist at the governmental level that are supposed to be able to provide this technical assistance. We have under the State Revolving Fund program that's nationwide, the ability to provide FMT assistance, financial, managerial, and technical assistance, and yet it has not reached these communities. And I think that that's your point, Steve. But we rest on our laurels thinking, well, we already have this program and it's available. You have trade organizations, rural water organizations that do a phenomenal job, and yet it doesn't necessarily reach these communities. And that's where I think, we often use the phrase, let's go for the communities that fall through the cracks, the ones that are left behind. Regulatory agencies don't like hearing that because it translates as there's a failure in the program. It is not a failure in the program. What they do is really good for who they're doing it, but they're not doing it for everyone. And in many instances, there isn't a recognition of who everyone is. So I think what we need to do is partner with entities like the doctor mentioned and like what Brent and I do with WFX and others. But those entities have to be disinterested in who gets the credit. It doesn't matter who caused the project to succeed. What matters is that the project succeeds. And that is critical in being able to reach to those communities, as Mario said, and get the water champions in those communities, because they're the ones that are going to be strapped with the fix afterwards. Brent, I see your hand is raised, so I'll pass the baton.
Carlos, great responses. Mario, to your point, there's been some really great discussions on, how it's not just money, it's governance, it's leadership, but it's also accountability. Here in the US, Steve, you mentioned Jackson, Mississippi. We're doing work in Mississippi, and I was in Jackson last week, and 160,000 population in their system, bad water, failing wastewater system. I mean, it's close to second world conditions, and a lot of that has been caused by economic decline and population decline. But there are sufficient funds and resources to address those systems. But the problem has been that system has been allowed to be in non-compliance for so long, and there's been a lack of accountability. And so increasingly, there's got to be a certain level of tough love that with these resources that are provided from the federal government, state government, there's a certain amount of accountability that comes along with that. And that's to assure that these systems take it upon themselves and invest their own resources and time and leadership to ensure that they can be sustainable long term. And that's what we're doing in small communities in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas, is really encouraging them to take these projects on themselves. You can help them find the money, but ultimately it's up to the leadership of those communities to ensure that those systems are sustainable long term.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. And I mean, this brings me back at that kind of local level that we're discussing on how to make it sustainable in the long term. So there is a question here about some of those details by Roger Miranda. So this question is for Dr. Dai. You alluded to the fact that a large percentage of low-income, unincorporated, incorporated communities, perhaps colonias, obtain most of their drinking water from private wells. They also cannot afford even testing their well water. Drilling a private well is expensive. How does these communities end up drilling private wells?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I think we're talking about a very similar situation. The previous hard discussion had happened. We're dealing with two things. One is existing poor infrastructure. Then the other thing is what's the future trend of building new wells. So to answer the first part is we have communities that people are living there. They rely on very old wells that could have been constructed in a very old way that is not resistant to any contamination can bring in. So that's kind of the same problem as the other group has discussed. Then for future new constructions, then you have to understand that the cost of building a well is kind of proportion to the depth you want to dig your well. So you can dig a well, but you can pay less. So you don't have to dig a very deep well. Then in that sense, the contamination risk of a shallow well will be much higher than a deep well. So that's a different issue, especially when people have the budget to build a well, but they don't know how much they need to dig, right? So you spend this first investment, you may end up with a well that's not really properly serve your drinking water quality purpose. So I hope that answers your question.
And I, just to put it in perspective, I mean, in some of the cases in California along the border, basically it is these mobile homes or mobile houses that a person just, well, a group of people get into the property of a given person, and it is their compadres or the people that they are working or how they are moving, and they just start getting into this property. Some of them people working in farms that they know how to get a good deal with a well driller, and it is very shallow. And then this just kind of uninformal. I have a land plot that I can bring some 15, 20, 40 mobile homes to put it in there to drill a well, to everyone chip in, and then having the problem of water quality and not being able to do the testing.
Yeah, and I see one comment in the chat box of a point of use treatment. That's great resource. Actually, that's also the recommendation we have for the people. If we find out in our project has high arsenic concentration in their drinking water, we have test some like filters. We kind of know. Again, I'm not here to endorse any product because we have to do something and tell people some answers. So we kind of know what kind of filter can remove arsenic efficiently in our lab.
And here we have things like here we have two questions that are they are together for any one of the speakers. So we have a question from Jerry and Marisa. So Jerry, is there a possibility to use natural methods of water treatment? And then the next one, which is Marisa, what are your perspective on long-term regionalization versus maintaining decentralized on-site systems, like the one that Jerry is mentioning, right? Like decentralized, not centralized. From a water supply and wastewater management perspective, also, there are examples of identifying state federal funding to subsidize operation and maintenance for these communities, to provide training, workforce development opportunities for community members to be employed, managing, maintaining their own systems. So I see the hands of, let's go this one all around. First, Carlos, then Mario.
The question on can we utilize natural systems? Absolutely. The question also then means and implies that the regulatory agencies have to understand that utilizing those, while it may not be their preferred way of handling it, it is a bridge to a better solution. And so absolutely using natural ways of polishing water, maintaining water quality in a receiving stream or preventing pollution, absolutely that needs to be looked at more carefully and promoted. To the question of regionalization versus decentralized, this is another, again, assumption that we have already fixed it, but we really haven't. So for example, in Texas, we have regional and regionalization as a mandated legislative preference all over the Texas Water Code. It is not just in one section, it is in several chapters. The legislature is unambiguously stated that the preferred, a strong preference towards regionalization. Where unfortunately it fails is it fails because at the local level, people feel that they're going to lose control. Well, there's governance structures that allow you to maintain that control, but still be able to advance towards a regional solution. So you have that local resistance that we need to overcome. I don't like my neighboring city because they beat us in football last year, and so I'm not going to work with them. That's stupid thinking, but it happens. The other part where it fails is you have statutory obligations and recommendations for regionalization. You have regulatory processes that give permits that fail to push regionalization. So it doesn't matter that it's in statute. Where you can advance it in permitting, we're not doing that, and we're not. And then we have preference in funding for regional solutions. I'm happy to say that there, regionalization is getting legs, but it's not to where it needs to be. So I think all of us need to understand that at the local level, we need to overcome this deal of I still need to be in control, and that because of that, I'm not going to work with my neighboring city. Fortunately, in the work that we're doing in Presidio County, those communities have gotten beyond that, and I'm glad to see that. But if we fail to capture, again, the strong preference that statutorily is mandated, and I'm sure it's the same in Mexico, Mario, you know, that it doesn't matter that you put it in law if you don't enforce it, and in this case it's through permitting, then what good is it? You know what I mean? Le estamos dando a tole con el dedo, that's all it is. So there you have it. That's my 2 cents.
Well, thank you. Once again, I see that most of the questions go in the direction of the traditional thinking. How do I solve the problems in the traditional way? We need to change that. We have not solved the problem yet. We have invested lots of money on both sides of the border, and the problem is still there. So why we want to keep this way to solve things? We need to think differently. I fully agree that the natural methods are better methods to clean the water than the traditional methods that most of our regulation establishes as you need to do this because this certifies that you get clean water. Well, this doesn't happen in reality in most of the cases because there is no sufficient law enforcement, at least on the Mexican side, to look not even on urban cities. And I'm sure that even for rural communities that are controlled by the state commissions, state water commissions, or the water utilities of the municipalities, they don't enforce the law. So we need to see that. We need to understand that. Again, the discussion of decentralized or regionalized. Again, the control of those people, it is not through that kinds of possibilities. Why? It doesn't has happened. There are lots of experiences that the communities by themselves have handled the water supply. We need to help them to go to the next step on the sanitation part with wetlands, with practical solutions, not technology for them, because no one will pay. You will establish, there is money, there will be money to establish the wastewater treatment plants, but no one will pay for the maintenance and operation for that. So we need to deliver adequate technologies according to the possibilities of those communities. I have seen that the social organizations in Africa, in Saudi Arabia, different thinking, different religion, different ways of watching the world, in providing the services. You need to adjust, you need to adapt to that kind of thinking. It is not an urban water utility, a traditional one. We know how to solve things for those kinds of populations, but not for the peri-urban, not for the rural isolated communities and marginalized. Again, the members of them are not integrated. They are not fully a community because they come from here and there to that part of the settlement. Again, the regulations, the laws needs to see that, give room to those possibilities, especially for those kinds of communities. Thank you.
Isis.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last thing of what Mario and Carlos said, that yes, the preferred solution is regional, but in order to get to that point, because the solutions have to come from the bottom up, and from the communities really understanding and designing their own solution, the answer evidently is education and capacity building in planning the water infrastructure projects in the long term, and increase capacity in water quality monitoring as well. So definitely that, to me, it's the next step.
Yeah, Isis, I think, well, I put a couple of links of some people that are, or some organizations that are doing some of the capacity building, but the reality is that the need is way, way larger that we can cover. Also, something that does happen is, at least for some institutions, federal institutions in the United States, you need to cross the drinking water limit to actually get funds to fix that problem. So you have to put the community that you are serving at risk so you can actually get later funds. It is super oxymoron. It's an operation and maintenance. It really is the biggie, because you can build the plant, keep pouring all the money towards there and the human resources. So anyway, we have some other comments in there, perhaps associated with that. So from Marusia, social participation can be done at the beginning of public policy proposals. However, we have a deep problem to integrate the majority of the population. And I think that is increased. Let me just go back to one comment that Mario mentioned, or put in one example. So the city of Nuevo Laredo, right? So it is in front of Laredo. I don't know, 6-7 years ago, the previous municipal mayor decided to provide land for one residential construction area without having a permit for a wastewater treatment. For many years, some of that part of the Nuevo Laredo has been dumping water into the Rio Grande, raw water. And then, of course, cities change, major changes. Ay, ay, ay. And it is, I don't know if the public policy, the political persons, the politician is still being accountable. Anyway, Brent.
Samuel, you mentioned the idiocy of the funding that you have to scale before you can get the funding, and it just doesn't make sense in many of these cases. The good news is that's changing in some respects. So USDA in the US obviously has program and grant funding for colonias, but they have been limited in their ability to disperse those funds to colonias because of the lack of governance. And so El Paso has, for example, has been wanting to extend, and many of your listeners may be familiar with this project, but they're extending their service lines out to some of the colonias surrounding El Paso. But to date, they haven't been able to, and El Paso has been asking for that money on behalf of the colonias to manage it, because the colonias in many cases just don't have the capacity to manage. But there was this regulatory limit on the ability for USDA to give El Paso that money. They're trying to fix that right now. So if that is fixed, that could be a big, big opportunity to reach some of these colonias, certainly within a closer geographic area of some of these cities.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. Yes, I think we're looking for kind of modifying or working around some of those policies, regulations to make it work.
Sam, can I quickly jump in? I want to touch in something that is sensitive and sparks my interest in this topic. We have talked about inclusion. We have not talked about transparency on the information and the data, especially on the Mexico side. I mean, and we're talking about monitoring, and we're talking about integrating and participation. People need to know what is happening, right? People need to learn what's the quality of their water. And that is, automatically directed to transparency of the information. And Mario and Sam, the Mexico side, that's a very huge taboo topic in terms of water. What is your take on transparency? What is the role of transparency? I mean, if we're talking about integrating communities and make them sustainable on their own, that means they need to be knowledgeable of the data related to their systems they're dependent on. So how much of that, I mean, it's at stake? Because I understand, some official authorities, cities might not want to share all the data they have, right? It's sensitive, it's public health. So some cities, some countries are very open, some others are not. Mexico is not naturally open. In the US is, I don't know what can you say about that? Brent went away, Mario. Where's Brent?
Well, the basic problem is that on the Mexican side, the governmental officials are on the spot because when the human rights of water and sanitation observatory comes to Mexico and see if Mexico complies with this, and if Mexico complies with the SDG, so most of the data are not true, because Mexico doesn't want to be exposed that Mexico is not focusing the investment particularly on these kinds of communities. So there is not a real inventory of how many communities of these kinds are, and how many of them have water supply and sanitation. The last Mexican census in 2020 exposed these things, because those people go to everywhere, to every place, and they ask the people if they do have water, access to water on their houses, or in a certain perimeter from their house, and also if they do have sewage, and if they do have sanitation. And these data are the most accurate information regarding the status of the Mexican water and sanitation situation. So I believe that transparency, it's good, but it doesn't help much in solving the problem, at least on the Mexican side, because most of the figures will be always polished to be put according to the standards, according to the international observations. So I believe that from the local perspective, from the local communities, from those people, of course, it is important for them to know what are their responsibilities and rights. And again, because most of those communities are irregular, they are not part of official settlement, they don't want to get exposed. So first, you need to socialize with them the importance to have the information. What is their situation? Otherwise, not say the truth, and you will not have exactly what is, you will not characterize the problem they do face. Again, we need to understand their circumstance, and we need to understand their capabilities in order to develop a good capacity building program, or social engagement in the development of specific project that can solve their problem. It is not only a matter of transparency. It is a matter of how do you approach those communities to find out their basic needs. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Carlos, and after you, we're gonna go with last comments from all of you.
You bet. I'm going to echo what Mario said. And as an example, in the United States, we have mandatory disclosure by utilities of the water quality service that they have. You know, the fallacy there is that by having that transparency, we got everyone covered. Let's go back to the original question. We are talking about communities that aren't serviced by anybody. So how are you going to get word out to them? They really have fallen through the cracks. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, okay, let's go with last thoughts on the subject from each of you. Who wants to start? Isis, you want to start?
I guess I just wanted to reiterate what I said in the past, which is I think the next logical step is to focus on capacity building for planning of water infrastructure and wastewater collection and treatment projects, not only on the technical side, but also on the long-term operations and maintenance. And that may require, looking at, okay, what is the governance that we have now? How are we going to maintain this system 10, 20, 30 years from now? Does it make sense to set a tariff structure? Does it make sense to, start thinking about a model to really have funds available for maintenance in the long term? And I think those discussions need to happen much earlier, and they must include the community that is benefiting.
Yeah, well said, Isis. And if it was anyone in the audience that it will be the water distribution system affected, we will be crying exactly the same as it is happening for all these disadvantaged communities. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Isis. Let's go with Susie. Susie, are you still there? Susie, you're muted, but if not, we can come back. Brent.
we didn't talk much about trust. And I think, as these communities have to trust those that are reaching out to help them. And I think there has to be boots on the ground, and we have to get involved in these communities and find those within the communities that we can work with, the champions who are going to take the time and effort to help solve their own problems. So that's a really important thing.
And I think going back what also Isis mentioned, that this is not an afterthought, right? That we were building capacities or we're building projects, and then I'm going to bring the community, and here it is. The trust to start like, okay, from the beginning, folks, we are on your side. Let's work this one together. It takes longer time. Yeah. Thanks, Brent. This is Carlos.
Well, keeping with trust is also honesty. We got to be honest with the fact that at least I feel that in Texas, we've done a lot of good in this issue, but we haven't done enough. And just like I mentioned that for Texas, you heard from Brent and other speakers that the same is true at every state. We know the problem exists. We've tried a lot of things. Some of those things have worked exceptionally well, but it hasn't been enough. Honesty also with, once you get a community excited about seeking a solution, you got to be honest about how viable that solution is, and what's achievable and what is not. And so with that, thanks a lot for putting this together. Always enjoy these. Looking forward to the next one.
Carlos, thank you. Muchas gracias. And speaking of honesty, transparency, trust, Mario brought me some flashbacks. So back in Mexico doing my social service, I worked for the municipality, the water supply municipality for Ecatepec, anyway, a suburban area in Mexico City. Well, I saw how they were doing the drinking water treatment, which it was just think of a PET bottle, a plastic bottle of Coca-Cola with some chlorine in it, and then a hole, they put it upside down, and as it was dripping, that was the system for the contaminating and putting chloride. That was eye-opening. Anyway, so that brought me some of the things that Mario was mentioning of being able to adapt to the community, to bring it, and to be, some of these things are just hidden. They are happening. No one in Mexico actually drinks from the tap. Just to be clear, you will have many of the people living in the US that go to Mexico that will have problems, stomach problems, perennial. No, this is true. Like, everyone is laughing. That happens from people living there anyway. So Mario.
Venganza de Moctezuma is called.
Yeah. Anyway, so
Moctezuma's vengeance.
Mario, any last comment? Any last word from?
Yes. I really believe that we need to make visible these communities. We need to make them visible, and I truly believe that a way of doing this is to issue a differentiated public policy. It shouldn't be within the urban and the rural. No. We need to focus a specific policy for them. And this policy should be translated into an ad hoc budget and financing. And this financing and this budget should be allocated for several things. First, we need to deliver manuals and guidelines how to formulate projects for those kinds of communities. We need to train the people that wants to help those communities in the traditional way. No, they need to have a different manual. Again, we need to have a training program for the community. We need to adapt the institutional framework to provide technical assistance, means of training for construction, operating, and maintaining these water supply services for those kinds of communities. We need to generate a portfolio for specific projects for these types of communities. We need to modify funding. B, for example, prioritizing rule to privilege these communities with ad hoc water and sanitation infrastructure, nature-based solutions, not traditional ones, nature-based solutions, and focus specific financing programs for this population, affordable for them, and to create a mechanism to facilitate citizen participation and private initiative, private people to invest in these communities. We need to highlight the need for them to invest under the concept of sponsor or donor or whatever, but we need to bring them to help that because the traditional solutions have failed. In short, we need to have a new way of addressing this. Thank you.
Susie, last but not least.
She wanted to speak. She's texting. Just give it a moment. She will. Susie, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now? You still cannot hear me?
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
Susie, now I think so. Go to the channel that is in English. Go at the bottom. There should be a glove, and you should select. It looks like a ball. Select English.
Okay. Let me see. That's probably
In the bottom bar, the menu at the bottom. So right next to share screen.
yeah, because I couldn't find that.
Should be there.
Maybe never mind.
Should be something there that is called English.
Yeah,
No,
she's in her
couldn't.
cell phone, so she's probably.
Yeah, I'm on my,
Oh,
on
I
my
see.
mobile. So that,
Yeah, but it
No, I
should
think
give
actually-
her. It should give her the option of the interpretation icon. Just to select the English button.
No, she's on her mobile. So actually, I mean, you can go ahead, but let me just see here. Can everyone unmute your original audio? So at the bottom, on the corner, go to unmute original audio. Si están aquí en el canal de español, por favor, en la parte de abajo pónganle unmute original audio o quitar el mute al audio original. Gracias. Listo. Go ahead, Susie. I think most of the people will be listening to you. Go ahead.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes. I just have actually short comments regarding to the policy to help the testing requirements. Because a big picture is currently for the 50 states, United States, about 30 states have this kind of or the other kind of testing regulation. 20 states wouldn't have those regulations right now. And if you think of if you do a property transaction, testing is required. This can promote a lot of testing in the current real estate market. Of course, there are many more restricted testing requirements can be associated with this type or the other type of business transaction. So that's one way to help improve the awareness together with the enforcement of testing. Then on the other side, some states have more kind of state resources to support those testing programs, but not in Texas. So I'm not saying Texas needs to have advocacy from state resource to help people testing, but I think have a regulation backed up associated with some activities will be a good incentive to help people in the community get the water tested. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you. We're about to wrap up because it's 5:31, but I just want to give you final thoughts for dinner tonight. Thoughts for dinner and from what I've learned from all of you. So thank you very much for all the speakers. This was very nurturing, as we promised it would be. And we need to keep discussing this. This is not enough. I mean, 1 hour and a half is not enough for this topic. Definitely, we need more. We need more time. We need more discussions. We need to change the chip, right, Mario? If we need to change the chip, we need more time. It's not an easy change.
No?
But let's start with these ideas first, and reflect on them. One is the problem will keep growing. Second, funding is not enough. Just as enough water will never be enough for all of us, and not on the projections that we have right now, especially not on surface water. We need participation, we need inclusion, we need transparency. We need the enforcement. We need to think about natural methods that are more sustainable in the long term. But that will require a lot of investment in education and awareness, and make people conscious about what they're doing. Why are they doing what they're doing, right? And that means they need awareness, they need knowledge. It's not just, and of course, trust. And Brent, thank you for bringing that. We can't do anything without trust. We can't be here today without trust, to start with. So this is a binational space, a binational forum, and the people that are here is because they trust us in the way we deliver information. So without trust, we just can't do anything. And the recipe, of course, capacity building, honesty, differentiated public policy, adult budgets, training people, nature-based solutions. It's hard. All of those needs a change in our chip on the way we think about water, on the way we think about drought, and the way we think about future in terms of water-related issues. So it requires a lot more than just money and infrastructure. It requires all of us involvement, stakeholder involvement, recognition, inclusion, all those big words that we hear all over the world right now. But those are the true words, and those are the most important and hard words to define and understand. So the challenge is huge, but it's not unsolvable. There are lessons learned, and probably the next one will be on lessons learned and how we can, adapt or learn from it, and focus on the border region to give some knowledge-based solutions to whoever is going to make decisions, and involve the community on this. Anyway, that's all my take. Of course, I want to thank again and forever the Permanent Forum team, the Dream Team, Isis, Carlos, Mario, Brent, of course, Susie, thank you. I mean, it was a great discussion. I learned a lot today, and I hope everyone else did. Sam, you want to say last words?
Oh, gracias. See you next year. We'll be around. This was fun. Good seeing everyone.
Thank you, guys. The recording will be available for those who weren't. I received a lot of emails saying that people wanted to be here today, but because of timing, it was not allowed. But it will be recorded and it will be posted on the site.